At this stage, it is my pleasure now to introduce the CEO of the Foundation for Rural and Regional Renewal, Ms Natalie Egleton. Natalie has been with the Foundation since 2012 and has been CEO since 2015. She is passionate about facilitating effective responses to issues facing rural communities. Could you please welcome Natalie?
Thanks for that welcome and introduction. Great to be here. Today I'm going to talk to you a bit about FRRR. I'm assuming there's a pretty good knowledge in the room about the Foundation for Rural and Regional Renewal, but I'll take you a bit through the work that we do and particularly focus in on some of the ways that we've partnered with local government across rural Victoria. But before I get into that, I do want to acknowledge the traditional owners of the lands on which we're gathering today and pay my respects to elders past, present and future, and of course to any elders that might be in the room today with us. So I feel like I'm preaching to the converted today, and a lot of what I will say you are absolutely at the coalface of. But for an organisation like FRRR, we're a national organisation. We see issues and trends and themes occurring across the country at both an aggregate level and a more granular level. And really what we see, and what you too would see, is that we are really in complex and turbulent times. And small communities, particularly small rural communities, are at the coalface of many of Australia's and indeed the globe's most pressing challenges. We think about natural resource management, livability, industry disruption, climate extremes and climate change, just to name a few. And change is occurring at an accelerated pace and really does call for dynamic responses. So I guess the question that we often ask ourselves at FRRR, and I know the questions that local leaders in rural Australia and rural Victoria ask themselves is, how can our communities best respond? What is needed to sustain and strengthen our rural, regional and remote communities so that they can thrive, not just survive? So I'm going to take you through a little bit about how we approach some of that work. I'm going to assume this just clicks. Excellent. So we all know that rural communities are faced with really diverse challenges, but they also have great opportunities. Some of the challenges that I know you would be experiencing and addressing in your local communities is really access to services, transport linkages and access, industry disruption, as I just mentioned, ageing populations, shrinking populations, and in some cases growing populations in particularly high amenity areas. Providing quality access to educational opportunities for residents in a lifelong sense, technological connectivity and access, and the tyranny of distance, which is a perennial challenge for any rural community. But what we also know is that there are great opportunities and really fantastic examples of how communities are leading the way in their own regions and presenting really leading practice opportunities for others to learn from. They think outside the square really well, and at FRRR we witness that every day, and as I said, it's often at quite a broad national level through what is effectively quite small grants that we make. So just a quick snapshot of FRRR. You'll see there that there's a picture of a toothbrush on a map of Australia. FRRR was referred to some years ago by a journalist as a philanthropic toothbrush, meaning that we get into the hard-to-reach places. So for the philanthropic sector, which is trusts and foundations, individual donors, corporates who want to give, often reaching the communities that you all lead is actually really challenging, and they need help to get there. And often the barriers include distance, not understanding the issues, not being able to actually access the communities. Just the pure scale is a challenge. So FRRR actually exists as a vehicle to enable philanthropy to reach the bush. We were established in 2000 and FRRR came out of the 1999 Regional Australia Summit, which was convened by John Anderson, who was then the Deputy PM, along with a number of other business and philanthropic leaders, including Ballyou Meyer, who continues to be FRRR's patron and is a great supporter of the bush in general. So our remit is extremely broad. We exist to be a champion for rural and regional Australia, to support the economic and social strength of those communities. Historically, there has been a very deliberate and intentional focus on smaller communities by FRRR. So I think in FRRR's very first year of providing grants, they made quite a few very big grants to regional centres, and there was a very strong focus on economic development. Over time, it became quite evident that the smaller communities, and particularly in a context of rural decline, really missing out, and that philanthropy could indeed play quite a catalytic role in supporting the sustainability and livability of those towns. So we tend to, and if any of you have ever seen our grant programs, they often have a priority on populations of under 10,000 people, and it's because we know that those small places actually really can do a lot with a small amount, firstly, and have far less opportunities than some of the other larger centres and certainly urban communities. The work we do is really, we are a partnership mechanism. So we exist to enable partnerships through government, philanthropy, business and individuals who want to give. And we do a few key things. One of them is provide grants, and that is the bulk of our work, and it's the bulk of what I'll talk about today, but we do a fair bit of capacity building work as well in helping not-for-profit groups within communities to understand how to access grants, to develop project planning strategies, budgets. You know, we spend an awful lot of time on the phone, and we also help them with fundraising through some dedicated partnerships, which I'll talk about a bit later. So everything that we do at FRRR is really fundamentally centred on strengthening and binding the people, place and prosperity of rural, regional and remote Australia. When we talk about people, it's about healthy, connected skills, communities and individuals. Place is about vibrant cultures, healthy environments, sustainable social and physical infrastructure. And when we think about prosperity, it's about having sustainable, viable and adaptive local economies that offer participation, inclusion and opportunities for everyone in those communities. So having been formed in 2000 in Victoria, so FRRR is headquartered in Bendigo, for anyone that didn't know that about us. Victoria, you know, has probably the largest philanthropic base in Australia and has a lot of old wealth, and so typically it is the heartland of philanthropy. So it is not surprising that the majority of FRRR support has been directed towards Victorian communities since inception. A couple of years ago, we undertook a retrospective review of all of the work that we'd done. There were 25,000 grant applications that we'd received since 2000 across the country, and we wanted to learn a bit more about the story behind those numbers. You know, what were the themes, what were the trends, what impact, if any, had FRRR and the partners that we work with had on those communities, and what was the nature of that impact? So when we were able to carve it up by state, obviously, and I thought today I'll hone in on Victoria, given you're all Victorians. So we've distributed $21.6 million into mostly small rural communities across Victoria. 651 individual towns have been supported through the foundation and our partners, and as you can see, the grant size is actually very small. The median is $4,000. So one of our questions in evaluating our work is, do small grants actually have an impact? There's a lot of discussion, particularly in philanthropy and sometimes in government as well, about you know, whether you're just throwing a stone in a big pond. Does it actually have a ripple effect? What is the impact? Certainly, we're convinced that small grants in the right place, the right time, in the right hands, in the right context are absolutely catalytic, and they can be game changers for communities. So we're pretty passionate about that, but we're frequently met with surprise when people see that $4,000 is the median. So the other piece for that is that this includes just the grants that we've made. So there are some other partnerships we've held over time, which I'll talk to a bit later, but particularly around disaster recovery, which have managed to bring in additional funding into communities. So this is just the grant programs that we've run. So I'm going to talk you through a bit of the numbers, and that's an awfully boring graph, I realise, but it just tells you, it just shows you over time the level of demand. So there's always been a really high level of demand for FRRR's grants from FRRR. We know that there are many other opportunities. There are local council grants, there are organisations like RACV, etc. But what we also know is that FRRR has a special ability to fund not-for-profit organisations that don't require the tax status that a lot of other funders have. And so that is very much the grassroots organisations and the volunteer groups within communities who don't have what the DGR1 status that would open up philanthropy to them. And so that's part of the reason that we receive such high demand. Most of the applications we receive are from those very grassroots organisations, and unfortunately we rarely have enough money to support them. But I think it tells us something about particularly those years. We can see 2010, so that would have been after the 2009 bushfires, where we provided a lot of support, but the need was just so great. I think historically it just is an interesting litmus to think about what was happening at those points in times in Victoria. And again, we can see there was a little spark around 2012 and 2011, and that would have been after the floods. So they both give us little hints there as well. And certainly earlier on there was some significant government investments as well. Okay, so on to some slightly more interesting things than just the numbers. So as I've, I think, conveyed, we really believe that local communities are best placed to know what they need in their communities, and for this reason we really design our grant programs to be responsive to what communities are telling us they need, and we try to have a broad enough scope that we can try to capture that and aggregate that information and then play it back as an opportunity to get funding, if you like. So we focus on 7 areas in our grant making, and they're listed there, and you can see historically in that graph the breakdown of where the greatest amount of funding has gone across those funding areas. The slightly interesting thing about where the funding has gone is that it somewhat reflects the funding partners' interests and trends in where philanthropy heads, because FRRR acts as that vehicle. But it also tells us something about where the bulk of the needs have been over time. And so we can see there that supporting lifelong learning and education has been an enormous area of support, and that's through our Back to School voucher program, but it's also through a number of grant programs where we've provided support to schools and other learning environments such as neighbourhood centres, preschools, to enable them to provide quality learning environments essentially, and upgrade facilities, buy new equipment, implement programs in partnership with local community groups, etc., etc. The other area is building community resilience, which is an incredibly broad term, I realise. When we talk about building community resilience, we include in there leadership capacity development, the strengthening of community facilities and community neighbourhood centres, and those anchor organisations that really bind communities, the volunteer groups. So that's a very broad church term, but that's what we think about when we're talking about community resilience. And obviously community health and social wellbeing in the yellow there is the other really large area that we've provided support in. So I don't think any of that is surprising, and I would dare say that would reflect a lot of your priority areas as well, and some of the things you'd be hearing from in your communities. But what we, I guess, find most interesting, and I'm going to share some case studies with you, is that when we do provide grants across those domains, they are the foundations of strong communities. If you've got those 3 things, the other things actually start to thrive as well. And so our view is that we're really focused on funding into the core capability requirements within local communities at that very grassroots level. And we realise, again, we're not the only ones there, and that certainly local governments play a critical role in that space as well. But that graph reflects some of that focus. And so to that end, when we think about the approach that FRRR takes, we're probably an organisation that fills gaps quite largely. We're an organisation, as the toothbrush analogy, it gets into those little places and it helps to fill the gaps and create a little bit more of an even playing field for those communities. So most of what we've supported has been about supporting access to activities and services in communities. And then it is about infrastructure and equipment. So again, it's about those 2 foundational elements being there in communities. And as you would know, many, particularly small towns, sometimes don't have basic things that they need to be able to convene their communities, to be able to lead and offer core activities and services. So fundamentally, a lot of the things we provide are air conditioners into halls so that they can actually have a range of opportunities for communities to come and hold events there, play groups through to seniors events. It might be water tanks so that they can actually harvest some water for a local facility. And to my mind, this is basic human rights stuff. We shouldn't have places in our country that don't have access to basic equipment and infrastructure that enables them to live well. And sadly, for much of rural Australia, that is the case. They are struggling just to keep places held together. So I think when I first joined FRRR back in 2012, I was a little bit dismayed at the lack of innovation that I was seeing. Why aren't we funding all the innovative stuff? And within a very short period of time, I realised what we're doing is really, really critical. And if we're not doing it, who is? Certainly local government is, but they can't do it all. Certainly there are some funders out there who focus on that stuff, but again, no one can do it all. And FRRR, I think, has a special role in filling that space and helping to bring funding into those things that really are very hard to get money for quite often. So I mentioned when we looked at the timescale graph that disaster recovery peaked back in 2010 and then again 2011-12. disaster recovery has been a really significant part of FRRR's work, particularly after Cyclone Yasi and an earlier cyclone in Queensland back in 2007, Larry. But obviously the 2009 bushfires really changed the world and changed those communities and changed the practice of both the philanthropic sector and obviously emergency management practice, which you would all be absolutely at the coalface of. And particularly the 2009, I mean, we're still providing support into the 2009 affected communities, and we will continue providing grant support to those communities for at least the next 5 or so years. And they continue to have needs, and those needs continue to change and evolve. And so I think it's really important to have organisations like FRRR that can play the long game in disaster recovery, because too often it's very difficult to stay the course for the recovery process. And so I guess FRRR as an independent organisation that can help to convene funding over time can kind of stay there and allow other bodies to keep moving on and addressing things that are continuing to emerge. So you'll see there that graph is broken down into emergency response and recovery. So they have been the predominant areas that we've provided support. The preparedness area, I think, is really interesting. It's been very limited in our grant funding. And a piece of work that we're developing at the moment and that we'll be rolling out in Victoria in the next couple of months is a project called Disaster Resilient Future Ready. We have information on that on our website, and really it is about developing an evidence-based model for community-led disaster preparedness. And thinking about how community leaders within towns actually bring everybody along and harness and bring together all of the different capabilities in communities and the authorised and informal leadership base within towns as well. So we're working closely with EMV. We will be coming to local councils with an invitation to talk to us about being involved in the program. And if it is something that you think is an issue in your Shire, certainly look us up and we're happy to have a chat about that. We've got some indicative areas that we'll be getting out to kick off those conversations. But certainly preparedness, there's plenty of evidence, and you would all know that it's critical to get on the front foot in communities. So in terms of common areas that we've funded, and I'm going to get onto some case studies now, really I guess the underlying principles that we celebrate and focus on in the organisation is that we really invest in place-based organisations. We're focused on the organisations, the not-for-profits that are in and of their communities. We will rarely fund an organisation from outside of a town unless that community has asked that organisation to come in and deliver something on their behalf. So we're very much about building the strength of that community from the inside out. Again, sound educational facilities, having appropriate equipment and infrastructure, investing in the local leadership base. We've partnered with a lot of the community leadership programs, brilliant organisations, but we also support informal approaches as well. And investing in ways that communities can develop their shared vision for the future and bring their communities along. So when I think about these traits, I'll touch on a few communities, and I dare say I'll be highlighting some case studies with representatives in the room who will be very familiar with the project. So if you want to add to it, please do stick up your hand as I go. So the Neil Early Years Centre. A few years ago, FRRR facilitated a $95,000 grant through the Hindmarsh Shire Council. So they visited us and talked to us about the incredible growth they had experienced in their community, mostly as a result of the migration program they'd had, which everyone knows is a great success story for Victoria. But they really needed to upgrade a lot of their infrastructure to meet the needs of a more complex community and also a growing community. So clearly the $95,000 was a relatively big amount of money, but it was just part of a much bigger funding requirement. It did help to generate some further funds, and sometimes what we hear is that the grant funding we provide can give a bit of confidence to others that there's some cash at the table from someone else, and can help to unlock some of the state funding as well, where we need to have matched funding. So, this facility is well and truly a couple of years old now. It must be 3 or 4 years old, in fact. And it's just a great testament to that community and what was possible. They've now got a brilliant integrated centre. They're running a huge amount of programs and activities there, and really it's quite a critical facility. It's a really exciting one. keep flicking through. So transport is such a critical issue in rural communities. You would all know this. We receive so many requests for community buses each week, and I dare say I'd love to do an audit of community buses somewhere around communities, because I'm sure that they're all locked up somewhere. Nonetheless, we all seem to need more. So Lake Bolac was spending, up to $10,000 a year in just hiring buses to get people around to things in the community. Which is clearly a really inefficient way, but coming up with the cash to actually buy a bus outright or even get a loan was really challenging. So FRRR, put in a really small grant of $5,000, which helped to contribute to the larger fundraising effort, which was nearly $60,000 in the end. So a really impressive effort, and they're now, really able to just transport. And you can see it's a sizable bus. It's not just a little one, so they're able to really get their community on the road, and that's connecting them with service providers and connecting them with activities outside of their town, which is really critical when they don't exist within your town. Okay, so obviously we live in ageing populations, and rural communities need to really think quite creatively and adapt their assets and their infrastructure and their environments to make them dementia-friendly communities. It's a really challenging issue, and I know a lot of you would be faced with this one. They really wanted to improve the quality of life for people with dementia, and one of the ways that they thought about doing that was to develop some resource kits that could be borrowed through the local library. So there was an access to information challenge that we were presented with when the funding request came through. That there was a lot of information out there, but people didn't necessarily know how to get it or where to get it or what was most up to date. So the resource library offset some of those challenges and really just made it accessible and meant that they could keep building on that as well. So the council had already, over time, invested in a lot of resources that were appropriate for inclusion in the kit, so they didn't need to actually create a lot. They just needed to be able to improve the access. So that was a really innovative process and a really small grant that now has made helping people with dementia to live well much more easy. So again, disaster recovery does seem to pop up quite a bit with us, and certainly when we are working with local government, disaster recovery is an area that we've typically partnered quite formally, where we have actually been able to help leverage funds into initiatives that are well and truly above and beyond either the responsibility or the capacity of that local government in the context of the disaster that they're dealing with. And the 2011 floods that affected Bridgewater and the rest of the state is a great example. So the tourism impact was significant, and the Bridgewater caravan park was really wiped out. So cash flow into communities, as you know, is just vital, and we were going right through the tourism season. So they needed to really be able to be back up and running so they didn't miss another season. So we managed to facilitate a $121,000 grant that enabled them to then leverage further money and really finish and got it, and it's probably in better state than it was before, which is sometimes what happens after disasters. You do end up with some better assets in the end. But that was through FRRR just being able to convene some conversations with donors, and there was one particular donor, the Percy Baxter Charitable Trust, who was able to come to the table with that grant and really help it to get across the board. So we're back in Hindmarsh. Is there anyone here from Hindmarsh? Yeah, a few of you. Excellent. So hopefully I'm reflecting things that you know. The ABC Haywire program is a grant program that FRRR runs in partnership with the ABC. It's about youth leadership, and it's about investing in young people's ideas and backing them with some funding to allow them to implement and lead some initiatives in their towns that are going to have a difference for young people in their communities. So the council partnered with some young people to implement a project called Back to Bush. And that idea came out of some young people who realised that there were some hidden gems in their towns that local young people didn't really appreciate, didn't use, didn't access, and that in fact lots of other people in the town didn't really appreciate. It's under your nose all the time, and you've got these amazing, beautiful places. But they also saw it as a way of potentially generating more tourism and providing a profile opportunity to bring people into the town. So this project is a really nice one. I haven't seen the full outcomes of this, but certainly rural communities have amazing gems, and we often face outwardly in terms of the tourism focus. But if some of our challenge is about retaining people in our communities and about providing sense of place and identity and connection to keep them there, this project is a great one. It's a great idea about shining the light on the things that are already in your community under your nose that you just might not have connected with. So it was a lovely one. Up in the Yarra Ranges Council area, engagement around the 2009 fire recovery was obviously pretty challenging when there are lots of hard-to-reach people in communities. And this project had a particular focus on engaging people with disabilities as well as more marginalised and vulnerable people. And so when you're in the hills, it's actually quite hard to reach a lot of people and get them to participate in programs and activities. So this was a voice mob project, so it was like a flash mob but a choir. So they did an amazing process of engaging different people in the community through different community organisations, developed performances, did choirs in paddocks and practiced and really got a beautiful level of engagement, and then popped up all over the Shire just doing flash choirs and singing in the streets and on hills and all sorts of places. And it was just a really positive, optimistic way of getting people involved who were very hard to reach in other ways. And it was a beautiful celebration of community that they managed to pull together there. So I mentioned earlier that FRRR has partnered with councils, particularly in formalised ways around disasters, but we've done that in other ways as well. And one of the key areas that we are able to most effectively partner with local government is through what we call not-for-profit fundraising accounts. And so it's a bit of a tax, it's not a loophole, but it's a way that FRRR is specially listed in the Tax Act to enable us to get funding into particularly economic development initiatives. And it means that we can set up an established partnership with an organisation for a particular purpose. Most of the time it's about a fixed asset. It might be the building of a new arts centre, you can see that one there in the Gippsland, or it might be about a program engaging a particular cohort in communities. So it's a way that FRRR can be a partner to council and access philanthropic funding. So you can raise money through grants with trusts and foundations, donations from individuals in your communities, channel those donations through FRRR. We provide the tax deduction, which councils can't, and which a lot of not-for-profit organisations in rural communities are unable to do. And we redirect those funds back to your organisation to deliver that particular project or initiative. So it means that we can kind of unlock money and get it into places that it usually wouldn't legally be allowed to go. Still, we can't fund core government business and we can't fund all of the typical things, but it's a really great opportunity, and we're always really keen because I think that between the local place-based knowledge, expertise, relationships and leadership of local government and FRRR's ability to help bring and catalyse some funding, that's a really good marriage, and I think we can help really stimulate some great development in communities through that approach. So please do talk to us about that if that's ever something that seems of interest to you. As I said, I think FRRR and local governments probably should be working a bit more closely than we do, and it was really a delightful offer to come today because I do think there's a great opportunity there. FRRR is here to be accessed, to be worked with, partnered with. We're a small organisation, we don't always have a lot of capacity, but we're always open for a conversation. We're always up for talking about how we can help your towns and communities. So obviously one of the key ways we can do that is to promote the grants that we provide into your communities. We often require letters of support for projects. When we get a letter of support from council endorsing or advocating for a project, it has a huge amount of weight for us. We rate that very, very highly because if local council is behind something that a community group is putting up, it means that they've got some backing and probably some sustainability about it as well. We often get into communities and run grant seeker workshops about how to get a grant, demystifying philanthropy. If you're ever wanting to do those, we're very happy to get on the road and co-host them with local government. I think it's a nice partnership as well because obviously councils often provide grant programs and we can make all of those dollars go further together, I think. And the partnership accounts, so the fundraising accounts, which I just mentioned then, are there to be used if it's useful and relevant at any time. And we also, I guess, have possibly a different kind of data and insight to the insights and data that you have. Our grants data is kind of interesting in a different way. So we're always happy to share what we've done in your Shire. We can do cuts of our grants data over time and give you a different lens that you might be able to look through. But certainly, partnership is our DNA. That's what we're here to do, and we really warmly invite anyone to get in touch with us. And I'm very happy to have some questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Natalie. And perhaps if I could just endorse Natalie's remarks with the Early Childhood Hub that Hindmarsh ventured. We had federal funding, we had state funding, and council put in some dollars, but we also had a fundraising committee that needed to raise several $100,000. And when you are able to obtain nearly $100,000 in one hit, it really set our fundraising committee up, and it came out of the blue. Nobody was really aware of the group at the time, but we were very, very appreciative of that support, Natalie, and it certainly kicked on our early childhood hub. Do we have any questions, please? Just a couple.
Just wondering about the time frame. Could any community group, because we've got a few community groups that don't have DRG status in Macedon Ranges and obviously need quite a lot of money, but I agree that leveraging of getting that first small amount of money to then build on, do they just approach you? Is there a time frame of which applications go out, or how do we get our community groups to sort of start that conversation, and should they talk to us as councils first before they're approaching you?
So yes, there are timeframes. We run grant rounds. So I guess the part I didn't speak clearly to is all of the grant funding that we grant out is not our money. So we raise it and then we grant it out. So there's a need for us to kind of maintain a structure around that. So at the moment we have a whole range of different grant programs that open periodically throughout the year. It's worth jumping onto our e-news. So there's a monthly e-newsletter that provides all of the updates, really worth subscribing to. There's lots of tips. If it can be forwarded through your networks, that's a really great resource. In terms of who they should talk to first, probably us first. And sometimes we might ask them if they've spoken to council, if it's something that council should logically be involved in. So, you know, if it's something you guys should be working on, then hopefully they have. But we can guide them on just eligibility, things they need to think about to strengthen their application. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thanks. I think I've stumped them. Thank you so much.
Okay. Thanks very much. Could you please thank Natalie? And again, to reiterate, it was a huge boost to us for our fundraising committee. It's not easy raising $300,000 or $400,000, but when you get a kickstart like that, it just gave the community and the committee a great buzz.